Everyone knows the story of David and Goliath. It's so famous it's become a cultural metaphor.
It's a David and Goliath battle.
David versus Goliath.
A David and Goliath battle.
The David and Goliath battle.
But what you might not know is that in the original story, it wasn't David who killed Goliath. While we all remember David's unbelievable triumph, his victory was lifted from a little-known warrior you've probably never heard of. To help explain, I'm joined by someone who has actually written on this very topic, Paul Davidson from the YouTube channel The Inquisitive Bible Reader.
Thank you for having me.
So Paul, who killed Goliath?
Well, Lachlan, as every child is taught in Sunday school, of course, we all know that Goliath was killed by that famous hero of Israelite legend, Elhanan, who of course no one has actually heard of. Everyone, of course, knows the story in 1 Samuel about David, the young shepherd boy who comes to see how his brothers are doing in battle and ends up killing the Philistine giant Goliath. But then way at the other end of Samuel, we've got this short story that occurs when David is old. He's already the king of Israel. One of his champions, a soldier named Elhanan, kills a giant named Goliath during a battle against the Philistines.
So what happens in the story of Elhanan?
David has been fighting the Philistines alongside his soldiers, but he has this close call with a giant named Ishbi-Benob. So his men say, okay, David, you can't fight on the battlefield anymore. You've got to stay home. And then after that, Israel has a few more battles with Philistines, and each time there's a Philistine giant that gets killed by one of David's men. And one of those giants is Goliath.
While the Elhanan story is much shorter, the two share a lot of similarities. Both champions are Bethlehemites. Both giants are called Goliath of Gath. Both weapons are described as a spear like a weaver's beam.
What are the odds that two different stories would describe a weapon that way? So it's clearly the same Goliath, and there's clearly some kind of literary borrowing one way or the other.
So if one of these tales borrowed from the other, which one was the earlier story?
And that happens a lot in the Bible, right? You have two similar stories, and you're not sure maybe which one is older, which one is newer. In this case, almost every scholar agrees that the David and Goliath story is the more recent story, and that the Elhanan story must be the older one. There's a number of reasons. One is that the David story simply has more problems. There's a lot of doublets, repeated material, contradictions that show up if you look really closely. And it seems like that version was being edited and rewritten at quite a late date. And it varies a lot between different manuscripts, especially between the Greek and the Hebrew.
Signs that the story has been edited include the fact that there are two introductions to David, and in the second, Saul doesn't know who he is. Goliath's death also seems to happen twice. First he's killed with the slingshot, but then he's killed again with the sword. The Hebrew text is actually much longer and more detailed than the oldest Greek manuscripts, indicating that the text was still in flux at quite a late date. One of the more interesting changes is that there's a change to Goliath's height.
So if you read a typical English Bible, I think it'll say 9 feet, because the Hebrew Masoretic text says 6 cubits in a span, and that's sort of what it works out to. So that's like, fantasy book giant, right? Like you're looking up, way up at him. But the older manuscripts, like the Septuagint, and I think now the Dead Sea Scrolls say 4 cubits in a span, which would make him 6'9".
So that's like an NBA player, right?
It's tall, but it's not freakishly tall. And in fact, King Saul himself was said to be head and shoulders above the other men in height. So King Saul is practically the same height as Goliath if you take that into account.
All of this points to the David and Goliath story being added or expanded later, but that's not the only reason scholars think that Elhanan was earlier.
A second reason to consider the David story later is that it would be very unusual to take a story about a famous person like David and then apply it to some nobody that no one has ever heard of, like Elhanan. It would be a lot easier to take this story about an unknown soldier and apply it to your favorite hero and say, well, actually, this guy David that we all like, he must have done it because, it was a great heroic act.
Further evidence that the David and Goliath story is a later expansion is that it seems to be influenced by Greek mythology. The idea of a contest of champions, two fighters in single combat, is a very Greek idea. You see it in the Homeric story of Troy. The description of Goliath's armor is also very Greek.
So he's got like a spear, a javelin, he's got the bronze greaves. And a lot of scholars look at this and say, well, this is basically what a Homeric warrior or a Greek hoplite wore. And so it could be inspired by the Greek mercenaries that were in the Middle East at that time, or simply have been inspired by Greek mythology.
It indicates that the Goliath story was added or updated in the post-exilic period. One thing I noticed when I read the NIV translation is that it says Elhanan killed the brother of Goliath. So what's going on there?
So if you look at the Elhanan story in 1 Chronicles 20, it says that Elhanan killed Lahmi, the brother of Goliath the Gittite, or Goliath of Gath. And so you kind of like, okay, what's going on there? How come they've invented this brother that isn't in Samuel? And so, if you want to harmonize these texts, you can say, well, obviously the Chronicler is right. Samuel made a mistake. So Goliath had a brother. And the NIV sort of took that as license to change Samuel to say Elhanan killed Goliath's brother. But actually, the Chronicler tended to also sort of fudge the story when he wanted to adjust something that he didn't agree with in Kings or Samuel. So here he took the word Bet-Lahmi, which means the Bethlehemite, and he changed it to Et-Lahmi, which almost looks the same, but it means Lahmi plus the direct object marker. And Lahmi is kind of a made-up name. Like there's no one else that was ever named Lahmi. And then he changed Et Goliath, which was Goliath plus the direct object marker, to be the very similar looking Ahi Goliath, which means brother of Goliath. So by tweaking two letters, the Chronicler kind of made the text say brother of Goliath with this new character Lahmi in it. When scholars look at that, it's pretty certain that the Samuel version is correct and that there was no brother of Goliath in the oldest version of the story.
One question still remains. If David and Goliath borrowed from the Elhanan story, why still include both stories?
There's a few ways to look at it. One is that the Bible actually does this all the time. They have multiple versions of the same tradition or very similar traditions that seem to contradict, and they didn't mind putting those all in together because their approach to history was very different than ours, where we want a set of facts that all agree with each other. Whereas they were working with, traditions that they wanted to preserve even if they seemed to contradict. And view of Graham Auld, who you probably know is one of the most famous scholars of Samuel and Kings, he sort of takes this view that the older parts of Samuel are the end, and they came from a separate work that we don't have anymore that he calls the Book of Two Houses. And then the earlier parts of Samuel, the detailed stories of David that are kind of the most fun, were sort of added on to flesh out the story and explain how all the dry stuff happened. And so in his view, the Book of the Two Houses, which had the serious facts like Elhanan killing Goliath, was just too important for the scribes to leave out. So they had to include that. And then even when they added on the new story of David killing Goliath, they just felt it all needed to be kept together.
So it seems like there was an original story of Elhanan and Goliath, and as David became a much more important figure, the story of Elhanan's victory was attributed to David. It's important to note, though, there is a lot of literary creativity within the David story, which spans an entire chapter, whereas the Elhanan account is only a few verses long. The authors of the David and Goliath story have created something new and original out of the earlier material. But it seems like David will continue to get all the credit. #Justice for Elhanan. Get it trending. A special thanks to Paul. You can check out his YouTube channel, The Inquisitive Bible Reader, and his biblical studies blog, Is That in the Bible? Links will be in the description.
Thank you. I had a great time.
Paul and I actually had a much longer conversation, which you can listen to in full on the channel. Anyway, thanks for watching. My name's Lachlan, and you've been watching Bible Unboxed.
Commandment number 11, share and comment below.